Hello there, I'm Ayen Bior, and this is Our Voices. My co-hosts Auriane Itangishaka and Hayde Fitzpatrick are standing by, and they'll join me in a minute to talk about housing justice amid the COVID-19 pandemic. Before we get to that conversation, take a look at this. Kenyan authorities forcibly evicted over 7,000 people from Nairobi slums this month, despite a court order and in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic, resulting in a small riot. Authorities say they demolished the homes because they were built on public land. But some of those who were evicted claim to have bought the land. Critics note mass evictions during a pandemic are inhumane and could further the spread of the virus, as Mohammed Yusuf reports from Nairobi.
42-year-old kiosk owner Daniel Ndungu and his 3 children picked through what is left of their home of more than 10 years in Nairobi's Ruai neighborhood. Defying a court order, authorities on Friday forcibly evicted Ndungu's family and more than 7,000 slum dwellers, making them homeless in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic.
I will stay here in the cold and wait. Now there's nowhere to go. Even if I want to move to a new place, there is no place to move and I have no money. Moving to a new place, people won't accept you because they will say you have coronavirus.
Others who could moved into the crowded dwellings of friends and relatives. The evictions, which started in April, left more than 5,000 people homeless earlier this month in Nairobi's Kariobangi neighborhood. The state-run Nairobi City Water and Sewerage Company claims ownership of the land and says the families have been occupying it illegally since 2008.
And people know this. People are told this in advance. You are actually sitting on public land. There's a project that is terminating here. We may be able to, probably open up and then pump sewage in this direction. People know this, but then either people don't move or they just continue staying there.
37-year-old butcher Hussein Wako says he has government receipts showing he owns the land he was forced off. But public land is too often sold illegally in Kenya, leaving those who were cheated out of their money, like Wako, also homeless.
They demolished our home and poor people's homes. I slept in the cold for 2 days, and there is a coronavirus pandemic. They told us to go back home when we demonstrated against the demolition. They disrupted it and tear-gassed us.
A small riot erupted earlier this month as evicted clashed with the police in Kariobangi and set fire to cars and tires. A Kenyan High Court had earlier ordered a halt to further demolitions until a petition by residents is heard in June. But for the thousands of Kenyans already left homeless and those still being evicted regardless, there is little hope they will see justice. Mohammed Yusuf for VOA News, Nairobi.
What a gut-wrenching story, and our thanks to Mohammed Yusuf for sharing that with us. And of course, ladies, this is an example of probably the worst case scenario during a time like this. Being forcibly pulled out of your home during any time is hard, but during a pandemic is especially difficult. But what do these stories tell us about how our economies are organized?
Well, Ayen, I'm going to look at the economy that I'm probably most familiar with, and that is South Africa, not just because I was born and raised there, but also because that's one of the most, if not the most unequal society in the world. And, the physical architecture of apartheid still exists in South Africa. Now, there are many people who do not want you to make mention to apartheid in relation to what the economic situation is today. But I have lived on both sides of South Africa's inequality. And I can tell you the same apartheid structures that I grew up in is still there today. When I go back, very little has changed. In fact, in some places, it now looks worse. So I'm saying, you have on the one hand, very luxurious homes with high walls and high fences where people are able to really self-isolate. But on the other hand, you have in many urban and peri-urban areas just blocks and blocks of overcrowded council flats, vast expanses of shanty towns and informal settlements where people are basically living on top of each other. So that inequality will now have an impact on how this virus is going to spread. And there are people who simply cannot self-isolate. It is in some cases safer to be out on the street than it is to actually be in your house, where there could be anything in your shack, where there could be anywhere from 15 to 10 to 15 people living in a shack, some who already have an infectious disease like TB, HIV. So you have to really look at what you're asking of people when you're telling people during a situation like the coronavirus and these lockdowns, where you tell people stay indoors for your own protection. Many people don't have the luxury of having homes that provide them with protection, so the inequality is what's going to drive a lot of the politics and the frustration we're going to start seeing from here on, and just that general question of how long is it going to take to fix this issue of land and housing.
It was definitely unfortunate, and we've seen these kind of situations where people are being moved out of their homes, and it's not just this story we just saw in Kenya, but it's unfortunate when a housing demolition is on an agenda for a government during this time. People who are already struggling to get jobs and to feed their families have to now face not having a place to stay during a lockdown. I mean, it shows that during the good times and the bad times, good economy, bad economy, the most vulnerable people and the most underprivileged people in our societies are always facing the brunt, the hardest. They always hit the hardest, and it's just the story never changes. And so I hope that in situations like this, the society itself, the people in the communities, the people who are a little bit more privileged can step in and help those people who are underprivileged and who are going through such hard times. I mean, I remember a story in Kisanui, Mombasa County, where a woman who was so poor and she had 8 children and she was boiling stones, pretending to cook for children as they cried themselves to sleep. And during that story, what we saw was that people came together and they rallied, and they ended up donating so much food, not just to her, but to her neighbors and everybody else who was underprivileged. So I think that this coronavirus situation is a time where people are realizing that we have to come together. We have to use the resources that we have as communities to really come together as one and to help one another. And so I hope that situations like this won't be happening, where people are losing their home in times where they're desperate for places to stay.
Ariane, I think that that's a really good point. I have to say, we read a lot about women who make less than $2 a day, women who are far off in the distance. But the thing is, I think for a lot of us, we either know someone or we were them at some point. My mom made less than $2 a day when we lived in Nairobi. And we lived a life where nothing was certain, not even the place that we called home. So to be in a pandemic where it's uncertain whether you can go home and protect yourself from the coronavirus, when that becomes uncertain, stories like these really strike a chord with me, because these are real challenges that I think a lot of people around the world are going through right now. And we've heard multiple times that it's either stay indoors and die of hunger, or go outside and die of the coronavirus. And it just makes me wonder, if there's been a lot of economic stimulus packages that have been announced in various countries, and of course there's been the moratoriums on evictions. Are these stimulus packages enough for people, even during this time?
I think that's a very good question. People are wondering that, when they're hearing these stimulus packages coming in different parts of the world and in Africa as well. I think that anything helps. You talked about women earning $2 a day. If a government can transfer $2 on an M-Pesa money transfer on the phone of a woman who has not worked in a few days, I think that can go a long way in her feeding her children. And so if you keep them home in a lockdown, whether it be for even a week, and without any kind of provision, it's very dangerous. It's most like a genocide. So I think any stimulus package that will put money in the people's pockets, however little it can go a very long way.
And I suppose this is what happens when you don't really have a huge middle class. We really need to focus in a post-COVID environment on strengthening the middle class and closing that inequality gap in our various countries. And there are those who have more who, are probably going to be expected to give more, just for the good of the country. Because as long as we have vast swaths of the economy and of the nation living in poverty, the country itself will always be dragged down by that kind of inequality. So our leaders are going to have to make really, really tough, but really, really smart decisions moving forward. Here is an opportunity now to do just that. So moving forward, here's an opportunity for us all to do better.
And I think we're also aware of how important it is for the lower and middle class to be strong, economic-wise. If the lower and middle class are unable to pay their rent, well, that impacts an entire economy, just for one country. And so hopefully we'll see more of that long-term planning come through. I've heard more than once through this entire pandemic, with people, calling for rent freezes and calling for moratoriums on evictions. I've heard people say that, the average person should have savings in their account for at least 3 months. The reality is that's really hard to do. And I hope that our lawmakers begin to ask themselves why that is hard to do. Why is it that a full day's work does not allow you to, have enough to pay for rent, but then also put some aside for a rainy day? I think this pandemic has been the biggest rainiest day that we've seen in probably our lifetimes, and I hope that it teaches us a lot about how our economies are designed and how we can better support the lower as well as the middle class. Ladies, thank you so much for this conversation. It's really been enlightening for our viewers at home. If you want to join this conversation, find us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Our handle is @VOA Our Voices. After the break, we have a lot more coming up, including a look at how inequality impacts everyday Africans.
Of Our Voices is about more than just sitting here and talking about women's issues. It's about listening to them
and bringing their opinions to the table and making sure their voices are heard.
Because our lived experiences, our stories, and our voices will help shape the next generation. Welcome back. You're with Our Voices. What does housing justice look like? What can governments do to expand it? And what has the COVID-19 pandemic taught us about it? I spoke to Margaret Kaplan at the Minnesota-based Housing Justice Center to get some answers.
Housing justice, sort of in a nutshell, is this idea that everybody has a right to safe, stable, and affordable housing in the community of their choice. That it really is fundamentally a human right. It's something that none of us can live without, and therefore it's something we have to fight toward if we want to have kind of a more just community and society in general.
A lot of your work involves working with policymakers and using the legal system. Can you tell us about what the role of government is in ensuring housing justice?
Yeah, well, and I think as I think about the role of government in housing justice, it really falls into a couple of different categories. One, and I think a lot of people spend time in this space, is the government's role in supporting and funding affordable housing. Markets are not designed to work with an outcome of justice. They are operating exactly the way they are intended to, which tends to be to maximize profit for investors and not really to meet the housing needs of low-income communities, communities of color, people with disabilities. That's where government steps in and says, we understand that the math doesn't work to create affordability, and we're going to put some money into that mix. So it's really that question of supply.
Keeping all of this in mind, what have you learned during the COVID-19 pandemic about housing justice and access to affordable housing?
One of the things that I would observe is that we were already in a very serious housing crisis because there were hundreds of thousands of people who were paying far more than they could for affordable places to call home. And a lot of the housing that people were experiencing was substandard, it was overcrowded, it wasn't in the places where people wanted to be because it wasn't near their jobs. So the ability to find a place that you want to call home had so many barriers to begin with. What COVID did in some ways is I think it exposed for more people some of these sort of deep and baked in inequities in the existing housing system, but those inequities were already there. But then it also increased the urgency of some of these issues because, we knew from the get-go that housing is a public health issue as well, too. Families can't thrive if they don't have a place to call home. In Minnesota, the last count that they did, and counts of people who are homeless are always undercounts of people who are homeless, but the last count is there were over 10,000 folks who didn't have a home at all. And people started to pay attention to this, I think, a little bit more just in terms of the public health hazard that creates for folks. But also, as you saw the response to COVID, it also showed who was most economically vulnerable. A lot of the jobs in the service sector, for example, even jobs in kind of the personal services, home health care, restaurant jobs, these are the folks who were already paying too much for housing, and now their income became much more unstable. And so that became a source of a lot of concern because I think it was something like almost 70% of households who were making less than $30,000 a year in Minnesota were paying more than half of their income toward their housing costs. When you project out and see what's going to be happening with incomes in the face of COVID, this becomes even more critical.
Our thanks to Margaret Kaplan and the Housing Justice Center for that interview. UN Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed said she is concerned COVID-19 could be a threat multiplier. She says it is a health, humanitarian, and development emergency, and these emergencies compound existing inequalities. The global economy will contract 3% this year, according to the International Monetary Fund. And the International Labor Organization says 1.6 billion workers in the informal economy are in immediate risk of having their livelihoods destroyed. To find out more about how COVID-19 is impacting inequality, my colleague Auriane Itangishaka spoke to Job Okanda with Oxfam.
COVID-19 has actually had a massive impact on global poverty and inequality, in the sense that actually at Oxfam our analysis shows that about 500 million people are likely to fall into poverty. 500 million people, that means 8% of the global population. COVID-19 has also exposed the underlying inequalities that exist, not just between nations, but also among societies. But it has also exposed the fact that public services matter more than private services.
That's right. Experts anticipate a change in inequality as a consequence of this disease. Now, how will it impact women specifically?
COVID-19 is actually impacting more on those in the informal sector. And we know that about 90% of women across the globe are employed in the informal sector. That means they've lost their jobs. UNDP, particularly for Africa, UNDP has estimated that about half of the formal jobs in Africa are likely to be lost just because of COVID-19. When we come back to the household levels, we're seeing that with the school shutdowns, children being at home, even those who are employed, who are in formal employment and working from home, they actually have to work from home and at the same time work for the home. We're seeing increasingly cases of gender-based violence, violence against women. With the schools shut down, our girls at home, we're likely to see cases of increased pregnancies, with income lost among families. And when schools reopen and a family has to make a choice between the girl or the boy going back to school, we're likely, as from previous experience, the family deciding that the boy goes to school and the girl remains at home. So it's going to actually have a very massive impact on women and girls, and maybe even roll back the gains made when it comes to achieving gender parity.
Now, when we look at the global stats, Africa has been hit relatively less with COVID-19 cases. Does this mean that sub-Saharan Africa's economies will be spared? And what can be done to mitigate impacts on vulnerable groups, as you've mentioned?
I agree with you that when you look in terms of infections, the numbers are low. Africa has been the epicenter of pandemics, but this time that epicenter moved away from Africa. But actually, Africa started feeling the impact of COVID-19 even before it reported its first case. We're seeing that the prices for oil, for example, have halved, and that oil alone makes about 40% of Africa's exports. The tourism industry, which in some countries make up to about 38% of GDP when you take the case of Seychelles, has actually come to a standstill completely. The airline industry has plunged completely. And this is having massive ripple effect. The disruption in the global supply chains means that those who depended on selling small electronics, for example, from China, lost immediately their livelihoods. It means that, for example, when you look at the flower industry, and we saw, around March, April, the flower companies in Kenya, for example, laying off about 30,000 temporary workers, majority of whom are women also, just because the market in Europe planned and they could not further sell their flowers. And so African economies are actually feeling the impact of COVID-19.
Still to come, imagine being in charge of how your country communicates with its citizens during this global pandemic. After the break, we introduce you to a woman who is doing just that at the age of 23. Welcome back, Bior with Our Voices, and this is our Women to Watch segment. Meet Emma Theofelus. At the age of 23, Ms. Theofelus is one of the youngest lawmakers in Africa. She is Namibia's new Deputy Minister for Information, Communication and Technology, and she's leading her country's communication campaign against the virus. We spoke to her about COVID-19, as well as her approach to her work.
My experiences and the voices I'm hearing from those that have come to the communication center to give their own experiences about how it has impacted their livelihood is that they would like to get a social safety net, of course, to try to get them through this time, to be able to buy basics, groceries, medicine if a child is sick, or whatever it may be, to be able to get through this time when people were restricted to their homes and not able to operate any type of activity outside their homes.
On a personal note for you, what has this been like for you? I mean, obviously this pandemic is new for everybody. What's it been like for you to be the face that Namibians see and the voice that they hear?
So for me, it has been a lot of transition and a bit of pressure to make sure that it does not persist, that people actually understand what they need to do, whether it's to keep a safe distance from one another, whether it's to wear a mask, to continuously wash their hands, and for them to fully understand the extent that if we do not comply with these things, we will be in this situation for longer. So it has been me trying to convince and try to persuade my fellow Namibians to adhere to these so that we're able to get back to making the economy run again and reviving it so that the impact is lessened. So it has been quite a transition and a time for me to really reflect on priorities that I will have to undertake, even post COVID-19 for my office, because COVID-19 brought a lot of distress, of course, but also a lot of outlook on what is important, outlook on what is to be prioritized, and also opportunities to permanently change things that were not working or not sustainable and do those now. without wasting any time.
And of course, you're doing all of this at such a young age. You're only 23 years old, and you're one of the youngest lawmakers in Africa. Do you think about this at all as you approach your work, not just with COVID, but even in your ministerial position?
I do. At the time I got appointed, there was of course a lot of discussion around so young, where's the experience and the know-how, and I think I decided to not respond to questions, but rather reflect it in the work I do, because there's only so much I can say. Everything else really is depending on what I'm able to do. And as a young person, my role really is to, of course, bring a youthful outlook to the position and to the ministry, and to some far extent the government of the Republic of Namibia, but also to balance my responsibility in advancing the youth agenda. Because it's a time when even myself have advocated for more youth representation in governmental positions or at the government table, decision-making table. And being given this opportunity has enabled me directly to champion that from a place of influence and decision-making. Of course, the challenges might be there, the obstacles might be there, because I'm one out of a number of people that are not in my age range, or might not see the world or see things the way I do as a young person. But I do not see that as an obstacle that I cannot overcome, because I think, unlike many things, governance, decision making requires a holistic approach. And my role is to contribute that youthful outlook and youthful voice, because I do recognize it's not the only right one or the only correct way. Others have had more experience than I have. I have to recognize that, and I have to appreciate that, and be able to collaborate on how we can transition properly, because overhauling a whole different thing at quickly and changing things very quickly might not be sustainable. So it's really a learning curve for me, and to reflect on what would be the best way I can serve the youth populace and also serve the mandate I've been given by the president on what deliverables I need to deliver for my ministry and in my position, and be able to balance the two.
Our thanks to Emma Theofelus for speaking with us. And that's all from us today. On behalf of the Voice of America, thanks for watching. Good day.